Attention, citizens, close your eyes and imagine the world's most powerful economy walking away from its greatest promise. August 15, 1971. A seemingly normal Sunday night. But President Richard Nixon was about to deliver a shockwave not to the Soviet Union, but to the very foundation of the American dollar. For 27 years, the global financial world operated under the Bretton Woods system, established in 1944. This wasn't merely a treaty. It was a global covenant where 44 allied nations agreed to peg their currencies to the US dollar, and in turn, the US guaranteed that the dollar was as good as gold, specifically, $35 for 1 ounce of gold. This was the ironclad promise that made the dollar the world's reserve currency, ensuring global monetary stability after World War II. It represented American trust, power, and discipline. But by 1971, that promise was under severe strain. The U.S. had financed the Vietnam War and extensive Great Society domestic programs, dramatically increasing the money supply. More dollars were circulating globally than the U.S. had gold to back them up. Foreign governments, notably France, under Charles de Gaulle, grew suspicious. They realized the U.S. was printing dollars much faster than it was accumulating gold. Sensing a potential confidence deficit, the demand became clear: give us our gold. The U.S. gold reserves were draining at an unsustainable rate. By the summer of '71, the Fort Knox vault was facing a critical level of depletion. The nation faced a genuine dilemma: fulfill the global commitment and risk financial insolvency, or take radical action. Nixon and his top advisors met secretly at Camp David. The resulting decision, the Nixon shock, was a profound maneuver that suspended the dollar's convertibility to gold. This action didn't just end the gold standard. It ended 5,000 years of monetary history rooted in tangible assets. The American dollar was now an experiment. To fully grasp the magnitude of the Nixon shock, we must examine the historical discipline he eliminated. Currency, linked to gold or silver, stretches back to the earliest civilizations. Gold's characteristics: its finite supply, difficulty in mining, and universal acceptance imposed a natural, immovable constraint on how much currency a government could issue. This constraint enforced financial discipline and limited the potential for reckless government spending. The Bretton Woods system was the final, modern iteration of this ancient, cautious contract. When Nixon unilaterally canceled the gold redeemability, he eliminated this fundamental boundary, replacing the gold standard with the fiat standard. The Latin term fiat means by decree, or let it be done. With this monumental shift, the dollar transformed. It was no longer a claim check on a piece of metal. Its value became rooted entirely in the government's decree and the collective belief in the full faith and credit of the United States. This was a massive ideological leap, transitioning money from a stable commodity to a flexible political tool. The financial discipline previously required by the gold peg was instantly replaced by political convenience and temptation. This decoupling immediately facilitated the age of unprecedented government spending, permanent budget deficits, and the creation of money out of thin air. It was the ultimate financial liberation for the political establishment, carrying the subtle long-term cost of inflation for every American citizen. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Global currency markets, unmoored from their golden anchor, began to float freely against one another. This ushered in an era of volatility that we still live with today. Exchange rates, once stable and predictable, became a source of constant speculation and risk. But what did this mean for the average person? In the short term, the move was sold as a way to protect the American economy from foreign speculators and stabilize the dollar. Nixon himself framed it as a temporary measure to create a new prosperity without war. But the long-term consequences were far more profound. With the government now able to create money without the constraint of gold reserves, the temptation to spend beyond its means became irresistible. Think of it like this: before 1971, the government had a debit card linked to a savings account with a fixed amount of gold. After 1971, it got a credit card with no spending limit. The bill for this spending doesn't just disappear. It's paid by everyone who holds dollars, through a hidden tax called inflation. As the supply of dollars increases, the purchasing power of each individual dollar decreases. Your savings buy less, your wages are worth less, and the cost of living steadily rises. This wasn't a bug in the new system, it was a feature. It allowed for the financing of ever-expanding government programs and military engagements without the politically unpopular act of directly raising taxes. This new era of fiat money fundamentally altered the relationship between citizens and their government. The gold standard, for all its flaws, provided a check on political power. It forced a level of accountability. By severing that link, the government granted itself a level of financial power previously unimaginable. The decision also reshaped the global economic landscape. While the dollar remained the world's reserve currency, its foundation had shifted from tangible value to trust in the U.S. political and economic system. Other countries were now forced to hold their reserves in a currency that could be devalued at the whim of American policymakers. This created a system often referred to as the petrodollar system, where major oil-producing nations agreed to price their oil in US dollars. This ensured a constant global demand for dollars, propping up its value even as the supply ballooned. But it also entangled U.S. foreign policy with global energy markets in complex and often volatile ways. The Nixon shock wasn't just a technical adjustment to monetary policy. It was a pivotal moment that redefined the very nature of money and power in the modern world. It unlocked the door to the massive debt accumulation we see today, not just in the U.S., but across the globe, as other nations followed suit with their own fiat currencies. Let's fast forward to today. The national debt has skyrocketed from around $400 billion in 1971 to tens of trillions. Persistent inflation, once a rare occurrence, has become a constant feature of our economic lives. The financial crises of recent decades, from the dot-com bubble to the 2008 meltdown, can all be traced, in part, to the massive credit expansion made possible by the fiat system. When money can be created without limit, it fuels speculative bubbles and distorts the real signals of the market. The discipline of saving is punished, while debt and consumption are rewarded. So, was it a necessary evil to save the American economy from collapse in 1971? Or was it a short-sighted decision that traded long-term stability for short-term political gain? Historians and economists still debate this fiercely. Proponents argue that the flexibility of a fiat system is essential for managing a modern, complex economy, allowing central banks to respond to recessions and crises. Critics argue that it's a fundamentally unstable and unjust system that inevitably leads to currency debasement and transfers wealth from the people to the state. What is undeniable is that on that Sunday night in August 1971, the world changed forever. We embarked on a global monetary experiment, the largest in human history, and we are all living with the consequences. The dollar in your pocket is no longer a claim on gold. It's a claim on a promise. A promise made not by the laws of nature, but by politicians. And that is a very different world indeed. Understanding this history is not just an academic exercise. It's crucial for understanding the economic challenges we face today. From the rising cost of living to the debates around cryptocurrencies and the future of money, the story of the Nixon shock is the story of how our modern financial world was born. It's a story of promises made and promises broken, of discipline abandoned for convenience, and of a decision that continues to shape the lives of billions of people every single day. Here's a crucial truth that Wall Street, and frankly, most investors, consistently overlook. The famous 1987 market rescue, the one that built Alan Greenspan's legend, was successful only because the economic conditions at that specific moment were perfect. It was a unique alignment of circumstances that simply does not exist today. Understanding why that rescue worked, and why it can't be replicated, is the key to understanding the precarious situation we're in right now. Let's break down the 3 core reasons why the 1987 intervention was so effective. First, and most importantly, the Federal Reserve had an enormous amount of power to adjust interest rates. Think about this. Before the crash, the federal funds rate was at 7.5%. That gave Chairman Greenspan a massive 750 basis points of room to maneuver. He could aggressively slash rates, injecting powerful stimulus directly into the economy. This wasn't just a minor tweak. It was a full-force monetary response, and critically, inflation was actually falling throughout 1987. This is a point that often gets lost in the story. Because inflation was heading down, the economic environment actively supported this aggressive monetary easing. Greenspan didn't have to worry that cutting rates would unleash a devastating inflationary spiral. He had a green light to act boldly, a luxury that central bankers today can only dream of. The second reason was the state of the nation's balance sheet. Our national debt was relatively contained. Back in 1987, the total national debt was just $2.4 trillion. That might sound like a lot, but it was only about 50% of our gross domestic product, or GDP. So, when the Fed stepped in and injected $17 billion of liquidity to stabilize the system, that amount was a tiny, almost negligible fraction of the total debt. The inflationary impact of this action was minimal because the nation's relatively small debt load could easily absorb that monetary expansion without causing severe ripple effects. Greenspan was able to expand the money supply so aggressively precisely because the country's finances were fundamentally under control. The system had the capacity to handle the shock and the cure. Third, and this is a big one, the underlying economy was structurally sound. The 1987 crash wasn't caused by a failing economy. It was primarily a technical disruption. The chaos was triggered by a software malfunction in the new, computerized program trading systems that had just come online. It was a technological glitch, not an economic cancer. The real economy was actually quite healthy. Corporate earnings were strong, and employment was stable. So, when Greenspan acted, he wasn't trying to resuscitate a dying patient. He was simply restoring confidence in a fundamentally healthy system that had been spooked by a technical failure. This perfect combination, high interest rates to cut, low national debt, falling inflation, and a problem that was technical, not fundamental, ensured the Fed's intervention would be a stunning success. But this was the exception. The perfect storm of favorable conditions that investors have mistakenly treated as a permanent rule ever since. Now, here's where the story takes a turn. While the Fed was executing this masterful market rescue, they were simultaneously, and perhaps unintentionally, creating the very structural problems that would severely limit their ability to act in the future. Every single intervention, starting in 1987, added to the national debt burden. Every round of liquidity injection and money creation reduced the Fed's capacity for future action. Every rate cut brought the economy one step closer to the dreaded zero lower bound, where traditional monetary policy loses its power. But most importantly, each successful rescue created what economists call moral hazard, and it did so on an unprecedented scale. Investors saw that the Fed would step in and started taking bigger and bigger risks. They began operating under the assumption, the core belief, that the Fed would always be there to prevent catastrophic losses. This became known as the Greenspan Put, the idea that the Fed had an implicit insurance policy out on the market. Companies, in turn, loaded up on debt because interest rates were being held artificially low. Asset valuations, from stocks to real estate, became inflated, pushed far beyond their historical norms. The entire American financial ecosystem began to evolve and reshape itself around the absolute certainty of Fed support. It became the central pillar of the financial world. This pattern was reinforced again and again over the next few decades. When the tech bubble burst in 2000, the response was aggressive rate cuts. When the global financial system melted down in 2008, the response was not just rate cuts, but a radical new policy called quantitative easing, or QE, where the Fed printed money to buy bonds directly. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, it triggered the most massive and unprecedented wave of money creation in history. Notice the trend. The financial firepower required for each successive rescue kept escalating, while at the same time, the Fed's structural capacity to provide that firepower was steadily shrinking. Fast forward to today, to 2024, the Greenspan Put has morphed into the most extensive and expensive financial insurance policy the world has ever known. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, a measure of its interventions, has exploded from around $800 billion in 2007 to over $7 trillion today. The federal debt has surged to over 120% of GDP, more than double the level in 1987. And now, unlike in 1987, we face persistent inflation, which ties the Fed's hands and makes aggressive easing incredibly dangerous. And here lies the greatest irony of this entire story. The very success of the 1987 rescue is what systematically created the structural limitations we face today. It set us on a path where each crisis required a bigger response, which in turn made the system more fragile and more dependent on the next bailout. The high debt, the stubborn inflation risk, and the sheer exhaustion of monetary tools are the direct descendants of that legendary intervention. The magic trick that worked perfectly once cannot be performed again, because the stage, the props, and the entire audience have been irrevocably changed by the performance itself. The exception that proved the rule has now become the trap. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this analysis insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the forces shaping our economy. See you in the next one. What if I told you the single greatest lesson from the 1987 stock market crash is now a dangerous illusion? Back then, the Federal Reserve, led by Alan Greenspan, stepped in and saved the day. It created a belief, a near-religious faith on Wall Street, that the Fed will always be there to rescue markets. But what happens when the rescuer's tools are broken? Let's fast forward to 2026, a hypothetical future where every single condition that allowed for that legendary rescue has been flipped on its head. The playbook that worked in 1987 is not just outdated, it's structurally impossible to run again. Let's start with the first major constraint, providing liquidity. Back in '87, when Greenspan injected what was then a massive amount of money into the system, the impact on inflation was almost nothing. It was a clean, effective move. Now, picture 2026. The national debt has ballooned to over $36 trillion. If the Fed tried a similar liquidity injection today, scaled to our much larger economy, it would be like pouring gasoline on a fire. We got a painful preview of this in 2021 and 2022. Remember when all that money printing, combined with our massive debt, gave us the worst inflation in 40 years? The Fed is now trapped. If a crisis hits, they face an impossible choice: print money and trigger runaway inflation, or stand by and risk the entire financial system seizing up. There's no good answer. Next up, constraint number 2, interest rate ammunition. In 1987, the Fed had a powerful weapon: Interest rates were at 7.5%. That gave them 750 basis points of room to cut, providing a huge stimulus to the economy. Today, we're sitting at a fraction of that. But the real problem isn't just the limited room to cut, it's that they can't even use the little room they have aggressively. Why? Because inflation is still lurking, structurally embedded in the economy. Any significant rate cut would risk reigniting it. On top of that, every time they cut rates now, it adds hundreds of billions of dollars to the government's annual interest payments on its debt. So, cutting rates to save the market actually makes the country's underlying financial problem even worse. The Fed is boxed in by the consequences of its own past actions. And that brings us to the third, and perhaps most critical constraint: credibility. In 1987, when Alan Greenspan spoke, the market listened and believed. His word alone was enough to calm nerves. That level of trust is gone. Think back to the whole transitory inflation saga of 2021. Chairman Jerome Powell repeatedly assured us that rising prices were just a temporary blip, even as our grocery bills and gas prices went through the roof. That episode shattered the Fed's credibility. So, the next time a crisis hits and the Fed chairman steps up to the microphone to say, "Don't worry, we've got this," the market's response will be different. It will be, "Show us the money." But as we've already seen, their ability to deliver immediate, massive action is severely limited. This gap between the Fed's promises and its ability to act will likely create more panic and volatility, not less. So, here's the bigger picture for this hypothetical 2026 crisis. It won't happen in a vacuum. It will land on an economy already weakened by years of structural problems. Corporate debt is sky-high, consumer savings have been decimated by inflation, and the federal government is in a fiscal doom loop, where interest payments on the debt are consuming a massive chunk of the budget. The financial stress that could trigger the next major correction can't be fixed with the old tools. The very medicine that has saved markets for the last 4 decades might now be the poison. The greatest illusion Wall Street ever sold was convincing investors that 1987 proved the Fed would always be there with a safety net. My parents taught me that the best defense against financial disaster is to question the assumptions everyone else takes for granted. The assumption of a permanent Fed backstop is now facing its most severe challenge in modern history. If you want to understand how to prepare your portfolio for a world where the old playbook no longer works, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.